The flickering fire cast eerie shadows on the trappers' faces as Marcus Vane, Sam Calloway, and Warren huddled around the flames, the journal of Elias still trembling in Marcus's hands. Midnight had settled upon the forest, the air heavy with the weight of the tales they had just read. Silence hung over them like a shroud, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. "I don't like this," Warren muttered, his eyes darting nervously to the surrounding darkness. "It's like the forest is listening." Sam scoffed, though his voice wavered. "It's just a story. Someone's wild imagination. We're sitting here scaring ourselves for nothing." Marcus, however, was silent, his gaze fixed on the journal in his lap. The final entry haunted him, "Shadow Creek will claim you too." He could feel the weight of those words pressing against his chest, an invisible force warning him to leave. But before any of them could speak further, the forest seemed to come alive. A chilling wind swept through the trees, extinguishing the fire in an instant. The sudden darkness was oppressive, the moonlight barely piercing through the canopy above. "What the hell was that?" Warren whispered, his voice trembling. Then they heard it, the faintest of whispers, carried on the wind. It was a language none of them understood, distorted and malevolent. The trees around them creaked and groaned, their twisted branches resembling clawed hands reaching out to ensnare them. Marcus stood abruptly, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." Sam shook his head, defiant. "You're letting a bunch of creepy noises get to you. We're safe here. It's just the woods playing tricks." But Marcus wasn't listening. His instincts screamed at him to run. "Warren, are you with me?" Warren hesitated, torn between his growing fear and loyalty to the group. "I don't know, Marcus. Splitting up seems like a bad idea." "We're not splitting up," Marcus snapped. "We all leave together." Sam folded his arms. "I'm not going anywhere. We came out here for a reason, and I'm not about to let some spooky stories chase me off." The tension was palpable, the group teetering on the edge of division. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, Warren nodded toward Marcus. "If you think we should leave, I'll go with you. But we're not leaving Sam and the others behind." Marcus clenched his jaw, frustrated but unwilling to abandon his companions. "Fine. We'll stick together. But the second things get worse, we're out of here." The group's uneasy truce was short-lived. The whispers grew louder, closer, as if the forest itself was mocking their indecision. The air grew colder, their breaths visible in the pale moonlight. A sense of dread settled over them, tangible and suffocating. As they sat in the oppressive silence, the fire suddenly reignited without warning. But the flames were no longer warm, they burned a sickly green, casting unnatural shadows that danced and twisted around them. Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." But before anyone could respond, the shadows around them began to shift, coalescing into vague, humanoid forms. The whispering turned into a chorus of guttural voices, overlapping and growing louder. Warren's face drained of color as he stumbled backward. "This isn't natural, this isn't real." Sam's bravado crumbled, his defiance giving way to fear. "Maybe we should move. Just to be safe." The group hurriedly doused the fire, their panic mounting as the voices continued to grow louder. They retreated to their camp, huddling together in one of the tents, their nerves frayed. But the forest wasn't done with them. As they tried to calm themselves, a faint scratching noise began on the canvas of the tent, slow and deliberate. It circled the tent, the sound dragging on as though taunting them. "Did you hear that?" Warren whispered, clutching his rifle tightly. "No one move," Marcus hissed, his own grip on his weapon tightening. The scratching stopped, replaced by silence so deep it pressed on their ears. Then, without warning, a handprint appeared on the outside of the tent, elongated, skeletal, and unlike anything human. The group froze, their collective terror palpable. Marcus whispered, "We have to leave. Now." But before they could act, the whispers returned, louder and more aggressive. The handprint dragged downward, leaving behind a trail of black, tar-like residue that seeped into the fabric of the tent. The trappers knew, deep in their hearts, that the journal's warnings were not mere stories. Shadow Creek had awakened, and it was coming for them. The night was thick with an oppressive stillness that pressed on their chests. The forest, which had once felt like a place of mystery, now felt like a living thing, watching, waiting. Marcus Vane sat close to the fire, his face drawn and pale from the horrors they had read in Elias's journal. He clutched his rifle, his fingers trembling. His gaze kept flicking to the shadows beyond the firelight, where the trees seemed to bend unnaturally, their twisted forms whispering in the windless night. He wasn't sure if it was the dark playing tricks on him, but he could have sworn the trees were leaning closer, as if reaching out to them. Warren, who had been unusually quiet for the past hour, was now muttering under his breath. His hand tightened around his axe, the metal glinting in the firelight. "This is madness. We're wasting time," he growled, but there was an edge to his voice, something hollow in his tone. Behind him, Sam Calloway leaned forward, his eyes sharp but tired. "I'm telling you, we need to get out of here. We..." Suddenly, the air around them shifted. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, slithered between the trees. At first, it was just a low murmur, too faint to be sure of. But then it grew, clearer, more insistent. The voices seemed to rise from the earth itself, a chorus of words that twisted in a language none of them understood. John, a younger member of the group, jumped to his feet, his face twisted in fear. "Do you hear that?" His voice was high, strained, as if he were struggling to keep it steady. He scanned the edges of the clearing, his eyes darting back and forth. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered, though his throat was dry and tight. The wind suddenly picked up, rustling the trees with an eerie hiss, but when it passed, the whispers remained, closer now, echoing with a deep, malevolent tone. "It's not the wind," Warren muttered, taking a step back, his hand shaking as he gripped the axe. The ground beneath them trembled. For a moment, they all froze, feeling a deep, gnawing sensation crawling up their spines. Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his throat, each thought a reminder of the terror pressing in on them. And then it happened. From the shadows of the trees, figures began to emerge, twisted shapes that seemed more shadow than substance, their outlines flickering like ghosts. They were humanoid but impossibly tall, their limbs elongated and their faces pale, stretched with expressions of unspeakable anguish. The air around them grew colder, the firelight flickering as if it were being smothered by some unseen force. "What the hell are those?" Sam muttered, his voice barely a whisper as his hand instinctively reached for his rifle. "They're not real," John said, his voice trembling as his eyes filled with a mix of dread and disbelief. "They can't be real." But the figures grew closer, their movements unnatural, their eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Marcus's breath hitched as one of the figures tilted its head at an unnatural angle, its lips curling into a twisted smile. Then, without warning, they moved. The group scattered in different directions, their hearts pounding in their chests as they sprinted through the dark forest, the strange, disembodied whispers chasing them. The trees seemed to close in on them, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, as if the very forest itself wanted to ensnare them. Marcus and Warren broke away from the group, but John and Sam, lagging behind, stumbled, their breaths ragged as the terrifying figures advanced. "John! Sam!" Marcus yelled, but the words felt heavy on his tongue, suffocated by the creeping fear. He spun around, only to see John fall, his face contorting in terror as something invisible yanked him toward the dark trees. A blood-curdling scream ripped through the air, a sound so pure with agony that it sent chills down Marcus's spine. "They're taking them," Warren whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Before Marcus could respond, a shadow darted in front of them. It was too fast, too unnatural. A ghostly figure, indistinct but unmistakably malevolent, loomed in their path. Marcus fired his rifle without thinking, the shot echoing through the forest. The figure faltered for a moment, but then it advanced, unbothered by the bullet that seemed to have no effect. "Move!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Warren's arm. They ran, not knowing where they were going, only knowing they had to escape. The night seemed endless. They ran for what felt like hours, only to come to a staggering halt. They had arrived at the same clearing they had started in. The same cursed ground. The fire was still there, the embers still glowing faintly in the dark. "What the hell?" Warren gasped, his voice trembling as he spun around. We didn't go in a circle, did we?" But Marcus could already feel the weight of it. This was no accident. The forest was pulling them back. No matter how far they ran, they could never escape. They were trapped. The rest of the night was a blur of terror and desperation. The whispers in the trees never stopped, never quieted, but it wasn't until the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon that they dared to hope for any relief. But as they gathered their gear, their hearts heavy with dread, they knew it wasn't over. In the distance, something caught Marcus's eye. An old, decrepit cottage stood alone among the trees. It was a building that seemed as though it had been forgotten by time itself. And yet, it stood there, waiting. This was no refuge. It was a trap, one they had walked right into. The place smelled of rot, a foul stench that clung to the air. The door creaked open with a slow, groaning sound that made their skin crawl. Inside, the walls were lined with strange symbols, drawn hastily with what appeared to be blood. But it wasn't just the symbols that made Marcus's stomach turn. The bones. There were remains scattered across the floor, human bones, partially burned, some charred beyond recognition. It was a gruesome sight, and the more they looked, the more it seemed as if the place was drenched in the remnants of something unspeakable. Warren took a deep breath, trying to hold back the bile rising in his throat. "What the hell happened here?" "I don't want to know," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The whispers began again, louder, angrier. They weren't alone. They ran, but the forest had already claimed them. The oppressive silence of the forest was deafening. Marcus and Warren stumbled out of the cursed cottage, their hearts pounding as if trying to escape their chests. The air felt heavier now, every breath tainted with the stench of decay and an underlying sense of dread. The shadows seemed to thicken, closing in like a predator stalking its prey. Behind them, Sam and John's absence was a gaping void, their screams echoing in Marcus's ears like a haunting melody. It wasn't just fear that gripped him, it was the realization that the forest was alive, feeding off their terror. "Where do we go now?" Warren asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His knuckles were white as he gripped his axe, his usual confidence eroded into raw fear. "Anywhere but here," Marcus replied, glancing over his shoulder. The cottage loomed behind them, its windows like hollow eyes watching them leave. They moved quickly, their footsteps crunching against the frost-covered ground. The forest seemed to twist and shift around them, the trees leaning unnaturally as if to block their path. The mist thickened, swirling like ghostly fingers that reached for their legs. The whispers returned, louder this time. They were no longer faint murmurs but guttural voices, laced with venom. Warren froze mid-step, his eyes wide with terror. Did you hear that?" Marcus nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Just keep moving." But the forest had other plans. They hadn't gone far when the first sign appeared, a set of footprints in the snow, too large and deep to belong to a human. Marcus stopped, staring at the tracks with unease. They weren't heading toward them, they were circling them. "What the hell is that?" Warren asked, his voice trembling. Before Marcus could respond, a loud crack echoed through the forest, like a tree snapping under immense pressure. Both men turned toward the sound, their breaths hitching as they saw it, a figure, cloaked in shadow, standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, impossibly so, its form distorted as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Its glowing eyes burned like embers, fixed intently on them. The figure raised a hand, or what resembled a hand, and pointed directly at Marcus. "Run!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Warren's arm and pulling him forward. They sprinted blindly through the woods, their lungs burning as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The trees seemed alive, their branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The forest floor shifted beneath their feet, as though trying to swallow them whole. Suddenly, Warren let out a strangled cry and fell, his leg caught in a gnarled root that seemed to move on its own. Marcus skidded to a halt and turned back, his heart pounding. "Hold on!" He knelt to free Warren, but the root tightened, pulling him deeper into the earth. Warren's eyes were wide with terror, his hands clawing at the ground. "It's got me! Get it off!" Marcus pulled with all his strength, his fingers digging into the soil. The root was cold and slimy, pulsating like a living thing. Finally, with a grunt, he managed to free Warren, and they scrambled to their feet. But the figure was closer now, its distorted form towering above them. Its presence was suffocating, the air around it crackling with an unnatural energy. It raised both arms, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. "We can't fight it!" Warren shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Then we run," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep it up. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of a frozen river, the icy surface shimmering under the faint moonlight. Marcus collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Warren leaned against a tree, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The river was eerily still, its surface unbroken. But as they stared at it, the whispers returned, softer this time but no less sinister. The water began to ripple, despite the absence of wind. "Do you see that?" Marcus whispered. Warren nodded, his grip tightening on his axe. "Something's in there." The ripples grew, spreading outward until the water began to churn violently. Suddenly, a hand, blackened and skeletal, broke the surface, clawing at the ice. Another hand followed, then a head. It was a woman, or at least what was left of one. Her hollow eyes locked onto Marcus, and she let out an ear-piercing scream that sent shivers down their spines. "Go!" Marcus yelled, dragging Warren away from the river. But the woman wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the icy water, their twisted forms clawing their way onto the shore. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if their bodies were being controlled by unseen strings. "They're everywhere!" Warren shouted, swinging his axe at one of the figures. The blade connected, but instead of falling, the creature simply dissolved into mist, only to reappear a few feet away. Marcus fired his rifle, but the bullets had no effect. The creatures advanced, their hollow eyes glowing with malice. "This isn't real," Marcus muttered, though the weight of his words felt hollow. They ran again, their bodies aching and their minds fraying at the edges. The forest was relentless, its whispers growing louder, more mocking. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark resembling screaming faces. Finally, they stumbled upon another clearing, a circle of dead trees surrounding a stone altar. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, glowing faintly in the darkness. Marcus and Warren exchanged a glance, both of them too exhausted to speak. But they knew one thing, they were no longer in control. The forest had brought them here for a reason. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, from the shadows, the figure appeared again, its form more defined now. It stepped into the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on the altar. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what it was doing. The figure raised a hand, and the symbols on the altar flared to life, casting an otherworldly glow over the clearing. "This isn't over," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. Warren nodded, gripping his axe tightly. "Whatever it is, it wants us here." The figure turned its gaze to them, and Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of dread. This was no ordinary curse. It was something far older, far darker. And it wasn't going to let them go. The clearing was silent, save for the distant whispers that still lingered, as if the forest itself was breathing down their necks. Marcus and Warren stood at the center, staring at the altar, its strange symbols glowing faintly in the dim light of their lantern. The oppressive weight of the forest was heavier than ever, and the shadows danced wildly around them, as though mocking their desperation. "We need to end this," Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. His fingers trembled as he held his rifle, the events of the past hours etched into his pale face. Warren glanced at him, his axe slung over his shoulder. "How? That thing, this place, it's not natural. Nothing we've done has worked. What do we even do?" Marcus knelt beside the altar, examining the symbols carved into its surface. The journal had mentioned breaking the curse, but Alias's last entries were fragmented and vague. There were references to fire, destruction, and something about severing the connection to the witch's spirit. He looked at Warren. The journal talked about burning it down, her cottage, this altar. All of it. The witch used this place to anchor her power. If we destroy it, maybe we can break her hold on the woods. Warren nodded slowly, though doubt clouded his eyes. "And if it doesn't work?" Marcus gave a grim smile. "Then we die trying. Either way, we end this." The journey back to the witch's cottage was torturous. The forest seemed to resist them at every step, branches clawing at their clothes and roots tripping them as they pushed forward. The whispers grew louder, more taunting, as if the forest knew what they intended. When they finally reached the cottage, the sight of it sent a shiver down their spines. The crooked structure looked more menacing than before, the faint glow of unnatural light emanating from within. Warren hesitated at the doorway. "Are we sure about this?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, lighting the lantern and illuminating the grotesque interior. The walls were lined with crude symbols, and the remains of the witch's victims were scattered across the room, bones arranged in sickening patterns, jars filled with blackened blood, and decayed trinkets that seemed to pulse with malevolence. "This is where it started," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the horror around him. "And this is where it ends." They doused the room in oil, their movements quick and purposeful. Marcus took a deep breath and lit a match, watching the tiny flame dance for a moment before tossing it onto the floor. The fire roared to life almost instantly, consuming the room with an intensity that was almost unnatural. The flames seemed alive, twisting and writhing as they devoured the cottage. But as the fire grew, so did the forest's resistance. The whispers turned into screams, the trees outside shaking violently as if enraged. The shadowy figure appeared again, standing at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on the burning cottage. "Marcus!" Warren shouted, pointing toward the figure. Marcus grabbed his rifle and fired, the shot ringing out and shattering the eerie noise for a brief moment. But the figure didn't move, it simply stood there, watching. "Let's go!" Marcus yelled, pulling Warren away from the flames. The forest fought them with every step as they fled downhill, the fire illuminating the woods behind them. The shadows stretched unnaturally, reaching for them like grasping hands. For hours, they ran, the forest twisting and looping in impossible ways. But finally, the trees began to thin, and the oppressive darkness lifted. The whispers faded, replaced by the faint sound of the wind. They stumbled out of the woods, collapsing onto a dirt road under the pale light of dawn. For the first time, the air felt clean, and the weight of the curse seemed to have lifted. Marcus looked back at the forest, its edge now still and silent. "Did we do it?" Warren nodded, though his face was still pale. "I think we did." But as they began their journey back to civilization, the unease lingered. The memory of the forest, the screams, the shadowy figure, it was all too vivid, too real. As they traveled down the desolate road, Marcus noticed something out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but when he turned, his heart sank. Standing at the edge of the woods, partially obscured by the trees, were the unmistakable figures of their fallen friends, John, Sam, and Elias. Their clothes were torn and bloodied, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they watched Marcus and Warren pass. Warren saw them too, his face paling as he gripped his axe tightly. "They're not real. They can't be real." But as they drove further, the figures appeared again, this time standing in the middle of a field, then beside an old barn. Each time, they seemed closer, their presence a chilling reminder of the forest they had escaped. Marcus eventually wrote down the entire tale, desperate to exorcise the memories from his mind. He documented every haunting detail, from Elias's journal to the cursed cottage, to the horrors they had endured in Shadow Creek. For a time, the story seemed like just that, a story. But rumors began to spread of travelers and hunters disappearing near Shadow Creek, their campsites left abandoned without any trace of what had happened. The curse they had broken was not destroyed, only weakened. The witch's malevolent spirit still lingered, growing stronger with each passing year. Her disciples, the shadowy figures of her victims, wandered the forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to stumble into their domain. And the forest itself, with its twisted trees and haunting whispers, remained as alive as ever, a living nightmare that would never truly end. Shadow Creek was still waiting,